What's going on, everybody? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another tech tip video. Today we're going to be talking about the braking system available on the F80 M3, F82, F83 M4, and the F87 M2. We have three different brake rotors here sitting on the table. These are going to be the parts that are typically replaced on most cars at some point in their life, generally. Maybe except for that one over there, but we'll get to that in a minute. So starting with this brake rotor here, most vehicles are going to be equipped with this. It's going to have a blue caliper like that. This is a 380 millimeter rotor in the front and a 370 millimeter rotor in the rear. It's an iron friction ring that is riveted to an aluminum hat. So case in point, that is not magnetic. And this is a pretty common brake rotor design on a lot of BMW M cars and also some other vehicles now as well from BMW. It's really good with heat dissipation because it allows the friction surface to expand and contract without affecting the hat right there. Moving on, we have this brake rotor right here, which is the F87 M2 M Sport brake option. So this is a 400 millimeter rotor in the front. And as you see, it's a very similar design to this 380 millimeter over here. Again, iron friction ring, aluminum hat, same design, same principle. This was only available on the F87 with the M2 M Sport brake package. So this would be the optional brake package. Otherwise, it would have had this. And then over here, we have the carbon ceramic brake. This is also a front, 400 millimeters, same size as this. We're going to get to the importance of that in a minute. But this would have been an optional brake package on the F80 M3, F82, F83 M4, and it was standard on the F87 M2 CS. It has a carbon ceramic friction ring that is bolted to an aluminum hat. This would be a true floating rotor right here. It's got bobbins, and again, this allows for expansion of the friction ring independently, or in this case, completely independently of the actual aluminum rotor hat right here. So these carbon ceramic rotors are extremely expensive, but if the vehicle is driven on the street, not track driven, these brakes should last the life of the vehicle, whereas these will be wear items that you're going to have to replace at some point. If they're damaged, you have to replace them. The most common damage you're going to get is going to be chips or chunks that are missing from the edge. That would be from removing a wheel improperly, having the wheel hit it, going back on. These are pretty sensitive to contact from debris. If you've been given a quote to replace carbon ceramic rotors on any of these vehicles, you know how expensive these are. Front rotors are over $5,000, rear rotors are over $4,000. The brake pads are also over $1,000. It's a very expensive braking system, provides great performance, great longevity, but again, these are very expensive parts relative to the option cost from the factory. If you have a vehicle with these carbon ceramic brakes, you can always convert to the iron rotor that was used on the M2 M Sport braking system because it's the exact same size, both front and rear, and it uses the same caliper, so therefore the brake pads will fit. You don't have to coat anything. We actually have a video on that conversion because we did that on our M4 project car behind us because unfortunately one of our rotors did have a chunk missing. So another thing to note, at least on this front, there are performance options on the market from companies like 034 Motorsport and Gyrodisc that actually make true floating two-piece rebuildable rotors in these configurations. So if you track the car or you're looking at using the vehicle for alternate means and you want to keep the existing brake calipers, you can get a true floating two-piece rebuildable rotor from some aftermarket suppliers or performance suppliers like 034 and Gyrodisc. So moving along here, we have a brake caliper. This is a Brembo P440 caliper that is very commonly used on many F chassis BMWs. In fact, this caliper can be disguised in many alternate colors depending on the vehicle that you have this on. So they can come yellow, orange, red as a BMW M Performance brake upgrade, or blue in this case, which means that it was factory equipped. But all of these calipers are marked. You'll have Brembo on the back. This one says 370/380, so this is a front caliper, and that means that this caliper is capable of using a 370 millimeter rotor or a 380 millimeter rotor. In the case of an M2, M3, M4 that uses this caliper, it's going to be for a 380 millimeter front rotor, but this exact same caliper is used on F30s and F22s and F23s as the M Performance upgrade or stock brake package or factory equipped M Sport brake package, which would use a 307mm rotor. So this is a very standard part, and that means that there are some options when it comes to this caliper. So this is specifically a two-piece caliper. So really it's two different parts that are then bolted together. The most common issue you're going to see on this particular caliper, it has phenolic brake pistons, which you can kind of see right here. It's basically like a plastic ceramic material. If you track these cars and drive them really hard and get the brakes really hot, these pistons have been known to crack, just strictly from heating cycles. There are aftermarket pistons on the market where you can replace these with aluminum ones. Additionally, when you're talking about high temperature, the rubber dust boots, these have also been known to burn off if you get them hot enough. So there are silicone boots that you can install in here to make them last a little bit longer. This is not really a true racing caliper, so it does need the dust boot on there. If you look at like something like an AP racing caliper that would be on factory-built race cars, there are no dust boots on those because, well, they don't really last when the brakes are 1,000 degrees. So that said, these calipers can be rebuilt. There's plenty of options out there. And this being a P440 caliper, that means it's a 4-piston, 2-piece caliper and uses 40mm pistons. If you were to repair these or rebuild them, you have 4 bolts to hold it together. You separate the halves. There's a bridge seal in between. You have to replace that. You bolt it back together and you're good to go. But the nice thing is these are a great upgrade option for a lot of cars out there. These are very plentiful and there's a lot of repair parts for them. So talking about brake calipers, let's talk about brake pads. So again, we're just comparing all the front brakes. But as you can see, there is a sizable difference here between brake pads, whether you have the 6-piston front calipers or the 4-piston front calipers. So a lot more material on the 6-piston, a little bit less material on the 4-piston. That is just the result of having a larger brake rotor and larger brake caliper. The nice thing is whether you have the 6-piston or the 4-piston caliper, there's plenty of brake pad options available. These are pretty standard brake pad sizes in the world of BMW. So if you're looking for low dust pads, those are available. If you're looking for factory style pads, those are available. If you're looking for race pads, those are available. If you're looking for autocross pads, those are available. You have all the flavors you can ever want. So you're good on that front. So mention that this car is over 80,000 miles on it. And if you look at this brake pad, there is a ton of material left on it. Very little wear, and that's pretty characteristic of a carbon ceramic braking system on a street car. In a perfect world, you'll never have to touch these. It literally lasts the life of the vehicle. A lot of people automatically assume that carbon ceramic brakes means that the car is track ready, and while yes, you can drive the car on track with carbon ceramics, the fact of the matter is you will run through these pads pretty quickly, and once you run through the pads and you're looking at $1,000+ for a brake pad set to service the brakes on this car, that becomes quickly unaffordable in the long run, which is why a lot of people will convert to the iron rotors, and then you have multiple different pad options. This is going to be the cheaper option for running on track, and you can always swap back and forth if you wanted to. One notable difference between your 2-piece iron rotors with the aluminum hat and the carbon ceramic rotor is BMW finally gave us a break, and it does make sense given the expense of these rotors. You don't want to hit it to get off the wheel hub, but there are 2 M8x125 holes that are threaded on the actual rotor hat itself. So all you need is 2 M8x125 bolts or screws, and you could thread those in and then basically walk the rotor off the wheel hub. So if anybody in Germany who works for BMW is listening, it'd be really cool if you could take that and put it on these, so we don't have to hit it with a hammer or use a rotor puller or anything like that. I mean, generally when you're taking these rotors off, it's because they're cooked and you're going to toss them. But in the cases where you are going to reuse the rotor, it would be really nice to have an easy way to get the rotor off, because unfortunately, galvanic corrosion is a thing, and that can really, really squeeze the rotor onto the wheel hub and make it hard to get off. That makes it super easy. So that said, if you do have carbon ceramic brakes on your M2, M3, M4, use the threaded holes that BMW provided you after you remove the set screws, of course. And these will come off very easily. I do recommend, though, if you are going to use that, though, put a lug bolt back in so that when this releases, it doesn't come flying off and hit the ground. That'll act as a, emergency stop, because the last thing you want to have happen is for one of these rotors to hit the ground. If it hits the ground or it hits something else hard, rotor's trash, and you will be very sad. So again, BMW, please put that on these. So if you notice this green plastic wrapped friction ring, this is related to a service bulletin that exists for a lot of cars that are using these semi-floating two-piece rotors. Some of these cars will exhibit a knocking noise while going over bumps at slow speed. And the service bulletin claims that it's because the brake rotor has microscopic movement on the wheel hub. So this friction ring is supposed to go in between the wheel hub and the back of the rotor hat to essentially keep everything sandwiched together properly. These can be purchased and then installed, and that should eliminate that noise if you happen to hear it. So moving along, brake pad wear sensors. These are going to be replaced every time you replace the brake pads on the vehicle. They're a two-stage system. So there's the intermediate stage that gives you a warning, and then there's the final stage, which is you're at your minimum thickness. If it hasn't been tripped, technically, I suppose you could reuse them, but more times than not, because these are exposed to pretty high temperatures, and you have a bunch of brake pad material and stuff that gets embedded, when you try to pull it out of the backing plate for the pad, it'll break or the clip will come out of it, and then it doesn't anchor itself back in. So my recommendation on these are cheap, just replace them. And again, it's not a bad idea to check the thickness of your brake pads from time to time, but these are a nice little safety item that are on the car. It's been around for a long time on the BMW front. In the case of these vehicles, there's one in the front axle, there's one in the rear axle, so there's one in the front left corner, and the rear axle is on the rear right. And then the other sensor that's related to your braking system would be your ABS wheel speed sensor. These are a Hall effect sensor, and what's interesting on these is they measure both wheel speed and direction of travel. One of these wheel speed sensors failing, you could have wheel speed being measured at the specific corner of the car, but maybe you don't have direction of travel. That will set off the ABS system. You'll have a bunch of warnings on the dash, particularly on these newer cars. You'll have multiple warnings on the iDrive screen, multiple warnings on the instrument cluster, super annoying. These do fail, and if they do fail, if you have a fault code for the wheel speed sensor, chances are it's the wheel speed sensor that failed. Another thing to consider, there's a magnetic ring that's built into both the wheel hub assembly in the front and the wheel bearing in the back. Sometimes those can get magnetic material stuck on them from road debris, and that can cause an interference between this sensor and that magnetic ring in the wheel bearing. So it is worth checking that. If you do happen to have intermittent faults, replace it, move on. And I think it goes without saying, we have a can of brake fluid here. This is some of the cheapest maintenance that you can do on any vehicle, regardless of the car. Realistically speaking, brake fluid is probably not replaced enough in most vehicles. In the case of BMW, it's a 2-year service interval, and that's part of the condition-based services that are built into the vehicle, so it'll give you a warning that you need to do a brake fluid service. No harm has ever come from servicing the brake fluid more often. Brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs moisture over time. The more moisture that is in the brake fluid, the lower the boiling point becomes. And I would say, if you're driving the car on the street, something like this Type 200 brake fluid, which is a slightly higher performance standard Dot 4 fluid, would be a good choice. If you are tracking the vehicle and you get your brake temperatures up, moving over to something like an RBF 600 or RBF 660, which is a higher boiling point brake fluid, might be something you'll want to consider. Even on a street-driven car, again, you do not want fluid that's in your system with moisture in it, because moisture wreaks havoc on all sorts of other things like your master cylinder, your ABS system, the brake lines. Just replace the brake fluid. It's cheap. It's no point extending those service intervals, in my opinion. So that said, we're going to put the car up in the air behind us. We're going to show you the 6 piston calipers that are available with the carbon ceramics and the M2 M Sport, along with the brake conversion we talked about, and then some of the other parts that are on the car that are worth knowing about. Welcome to the engine bay of a F82 M4. It's a packaging nightmare. Something you're definitely going to want to get access to is going to be your master cylinder reservoir. So on a left-hand drive car, it's going to be behind this little cover here, and on your right-hand drive cars, it's obviously going to be on the opposing side. That said, you just simply twist these little lock tabs here, quarter turn, and then you have access to your master cylinder reservoir, which is located directly on top of the master cylinder. And then over here you have your ABS hydraulic unit. So it's both the hydraulic unit itself and the control module. It's all in one, attached directly to the brake booster. It's all tucked under here. Level sensor is incorporated with the master cylinder reservoir. And the brake booster is vacuum supplied, so there's a bunch of vacuum lines with a check valve. That said, you know, long term, and we're talking, you know, cars that are 20 years age, which we're not even there yet, you know, brake boosters can fail. One of the more common ways in which brake boosters fail is because of internal leakage from the master cylinder into the brake booster itself. So we've seen on some other cars where a seal leak on the backside of the master cylinder causes brake fluid to get inside the brake booster itself, and that can cause a bunch of corrosion and issues with the diaphragm. So as you can see, if you do need to remove this unit, it's buried in there. You have to take out the cross brace, the carbon fiber brakes here, all the stuff's going to have to come out, and it is very tightly packaged. But the good news is, again, that's not a common scenario. That's, you know, vehicles that are very old. Also worth noting on this car, the vacuum pump is driven by the engine. So that is all the way down under there. You have the brake booster vacuum pump, which is bolted to the engine block. It is driven by the oil pump chain. And then the vacuum pump also drives both high pressure fuel pumps. So it's all tucked under there behind the alternator, underneath the intake manifold. If you have an issue with the vacuum pump, charge cooler is coming out, the intake manifold's coming out, the lower portion of the engine is basically going to have to be partially disassembled to get access to the sprocket which drives the vacuum pump itself. So it's not quite a timing job, but it is almost very close to being one. Again, it's a mechanical vacuum pump, and we haven't seen any evidence that those are a huge problem. But it is something to be aware of, that if you do lose brake assist via the booster, aka there's no vacuum, could be a failed vacuum pump, and that is a huge job. That is just tucked down in there. So just hope you don't have that problem. So now we have a look at the, what would have been the carbon ceramic brake calipers, but like I said, we've converted to the iron rotors from the M2 M Sport, but this caliper is also standardized between the carbon ceramic brake package and the M Sport brake package on the M2. In this case, these are monoblock calipers from Brembo, so it's all one piece. And in this case, on our fronts, it's a 36 millimeter, 34, and 30 millimeter piston size, so they are different sizes through. One thing you know, because this is an 80,000 mile original caliper, the discoloration on it. That seems to be a very common problem on these calipers specifically, and realistically, the reason for that is harsh cleaning chemicals. So, you know, any kind of wheel cleaner could potentially do this, especially if it's not like a pH neutral cleaner. You could also get discoloration if the brakes get super hot. That's not the case here. When you see this like sort of orange buildup on that, that is just from a very acidic brake cleaner or wheel cleaner that has been put on it. So you really want to be careful if you happen to care about the cosmetics of your brake caliper. That said, it's not uncommon to see little chips and little marks. That's going to happen over time, particularly with this braking system because it's so large. I mean, the minimum wheel size you're going to have on the car is 19 inches. And there's very little room between the barrel of the wheel and the caliper itself, so it's not uncommon for pebbles and debris to get stuck. And you can actually see those marks here on the caliper. It'll mar the inside of the wheel, it'll mar the caliper. That just unfortunately is the nature of a braking system that is this large. We're going off on a little tangent here, but one thing that I can tell you is the brake rotor set screws for the front rotors on these cars, it is only used on the front. The set screws used on the rear are like a pretty universal BMW set screw that's been used forever. This style set screw, I don't know what it is on these cars specifically, but they love to seize into the wheel hubs. They're a very tiny Allen drive. From my memory, I think these are 5 millimeter Allen, whereas they're 6 millimeter Allen in the rear. and these will round out very easily. And whatever material they use on these are also hardened, so they're very difficult to drill out. That said, you know, the set screw is only responsible for holding the rotor on the wheel hub when the vehicle is being assembled. So they're not required, but they are nice to have on there. I would say if you're fortunate enough to have these things come out, put a little dab of anti-seize on them, or even Loctite for that matter, some blue Loctite, low strength thread locker, because that's going to seal off the threads from the hub and prevent corrosion from forming and basically squeezing those threads. For those of you that don't know, Loctite is actually technically a thread sealant. It's just taking up that void between the female and male threads, and that prevents moisture from getting in, also prevents vibration from loosening things. But think of thread locker as a thread sealant. It's just taking up that empty space, and that will prevent you from having the frustration of having to drill these out. The only thing we did not talk about on the table were the brake hoses. They are a service item. In fact, they're probably not replaced anywhere near enough on most vehicles. One of the common issues you'll see with brake hoses, particularly your stock rubber hoses, is the internal structure of the hose will collapse and basically constrict over time. So if you look at a brand new hose compared to an old higher mileage hose, the internal diameter of those will change. Over time, they start to shrink. That restricts the flow of brake fluid through the system. But what can happen in very extreme circumstances is you can have a brake hose that collapses internally, and when you hit the brake pedal, the pressure of the brake fluid will actually open that restriction and get pressure to the brake caliper so the vehicle responds normally. But because of that restriction, as soon as you let go of the brake pedal and depressurize the system, that pressure stays trapped in the caliper and will cause the brake pads to drag. A lot of people misdiagnosed those as like seized calipers, or there's something wrong with the caliper. Put a brand new caliper on it, you still have the same problem. More than likely, it's a internally collapsed brake hose. And my recommendation is always going to be, if you're replacing, let's say, a brake hose on one corner of the car because you see a bubble, or there's a fray, or there's any kind of cosmetic damage, do the same on the other side. Replace them in matched pairs. That way the flow of brake fluid is the same on both sides. And quite frankly, if you're replacing one brake hose on the car, these things are cheap. Replace all four. Just make your life a little bit easier. And one thing I could say, if you do have to replace the brake hose, the way that BMW has you do it, you have a threaded female end that goes to the brake caliper, and then you have a junction up here that goes to a hard line. You're going to want to unthread the hard line from the brake hose first, remove the brake hose then from the caliper. You'll then thread the brake hose into the caliper first, tighten it down. It's basically a flare fitting inside, so it bottoms out, and that's what makes the seal. There's a torque spec for those as well. Then you're going to route the brake hose up to the hard line. Then you're going to tighten down the flare nut on the hard line to the brake hose after you get it into the little holder. One thing I have seen on these later model vehicles, BMW has this coating. Basically, it's like a protective coating on the outside of the brake line. That's all good and dandy. But what I have seen on the flare nut on the hard line is underneath that, there is none of that coating. So you can get corrosion between the flare nut and the hard line, and when you go to break that flare nut loose, you'll notice that it's not spinning independently of the hard line. If it's not spinning independently of the hard line, stop turning it. Because all you'll do is twist the hard line, and now you're replacing the hard line. What you can do, on the other hand, is use a little bit of heat. My recommendation is to open the bleeder screw on the caliper if you're going to do this, because you'll want the expansion of the brake fluid to come out of the brake caliper, not explode out of that hard line once you release it. Put a little bit of heat here at this junction, and you want to work it back and forth, and it eventually will come free. But that's just a heads up, because I have seen some of these flare nuts not spin freely on these coated lines that BMW started using with the F chassis cars, so just be aware. So now we're here at the rear, and again, this is an M2 M Sport rear rotor with the what would have been carbon ceramic brake calipers, but we've already addressed this. These calipers are the same. So this is a monoblock 4-piston in the rear, 28mm pistons, and just for the ha-has, here is the front caliper we talked about with the standard braking package. It's basically the same size. So the rear calipers on this setup are basically the same size as the front calipers for the more standard braking system, which is kind of crazy. Also, you notice this M2 M Sport rotor has crazy venting on it. If you compare that to the carbon ceramic rotor that'll be on here, there's no opening on the carbon ceramic side, but on the M2 M Sport side, there's a ton of space here for air to move through and out. So it's a pretty crazy looking rotor. It actually looks something more like you would see on a motorcycle. See the little bit difference of the set screw here. It's got a much larger head on it, and it's a 6mm Allen drive as opposed to a 5mm Allen drive. So these tend to come out no problem. Some packaging nightmare in the back, just in terms of all the control arms and stuff, but BMW gave you a little flap in the back here to gain access for the connectors for the wheel speed sensor and brake pad wear sensor here on the rear right side. But you do have to trace those lines all the way through. You have a little plastic bracket that holds those to this upper control arm, and then obviously they branch off and go to where they need to go. But just want to touch base here on the rear real quick to show you kind of what the layout of the braking system is, what the 4-piston calipers look like on this setup, and generally where everything goes. I will say, I did mention in the front the problem with the hard line and the flare nut seizing. It's usually going to be on the back that you have this problem because you just have a ton of debris that flows through here and everything is pretty tightly packaged. I'm looking at this flare nut and there's a bunch of stuff filled in from behind. So I can assume this one right here might be giving us a problem if we ever have to take this soft line off. So that's a really good example of what you might see as a heads up before you start touching that nut. Be prepared to go to battle. So that's pretty much it. So with that said, I hope you learned a lot about the braking systems that are available on the F87 M2, F80 M3, and F82, F83 M4. I mean, braking systems for the most part on all cars are pretty standardized. There are pretty simple systems through and through. The only complications on the electronic side, particularly with things like the ABS hydraulic unit, but mechanically, you got rotors, you got brake calipers. You do have some finicky stuff between different braking systems that you need to be aware of. But for the most part, everything on these cars is very standardized. If you've ever done a brake job on another vehicle, it's not going to be really any different here. So it is definitely something that you can maintain and service yourself. And of course, we've talked about being able to convert from a very expensive option to a more cost-effective option, depending on what scenario you're dealing with. And of course, some of the maintenance things you're going to want to know about during the ownership of this car, i.e. changing your brake fluid regularly, which is very cheap maintenance. But other than that, I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. If you have any experience with these vehicles or any stories on the braking system front, please share them. We have a lot of videos on the way on our F82 M4 project car, so you'll want to hit subscribe for that. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.